I saved Shirji, the heroine of Growing Vegetables for Text. But I've been brewing my revenge. This time, I won't let her get away with it. In my chaotic life, Shirji used the spatial scroll inside her jade pendant to steal the treasure I had been searching for and the precious ginseng needed to cure my mother's illness. As she left, she gave us 10 ounces of silver and coldly said, "We no longer owe each other anything." What's more infuriating is that she intentionally left clues, leading the mob into her home, and my family was brutally killed. I and my mother were murdered. Only after death did I realize that Shirji was a time traveler from modern times who had obtained a special jade pendant, allowing her to become the richest and eventually marry into royalty. However, fate gave me a second chance. After I was reborn, I heard a faint cry for help coming from a woman hanging off a cliff, and it was none other than Shirji. She begged me,
"Miss, save me!"
This scene felt familiar. I quickly realized it was a chance given by heaven, and I had been reborn to the moment when I first met Shirji. I knelt at the edge of the cliff, looking at her.
"How do you want me to save you?"
Shirji pleaded.
"Miss, pull me up quick, or I'll fall."
As I gazed at Shirji's face, my heart was filled with conflicting emotions. In my past life, I helped her without hesitation and took care of her, only to be repaid with malice. This time, I wouldn't be so foolish. I sneered. "Why should I save you?" Shirji begged urgently. "You seem kind. How can you ignore someone dying?" I replied. "If you want to be saved, pay the price. How about that jade pendant as a consultation fee?" I pointed to the pendant around her neck. Shirji refused initially because the jade pendant contained space and a spiritual spring, her lifeline. I said calmly, "Oh, forget it then." As I turned to leave, Shirji panicked seeing herself about to fall, crying out,
"Wait! Take it!"
She agreed to give me the pendant. I walked back and pulled the pendant off her neck. A flash of anger crossed Shirji's eyes, but she controlled herself. "Since you took my valuable pendant, you must save me and treat my wounds." I didn't respond, but Shirji didn't know that I knew the transfer method of the pendant. Transferring the pendant requires unlocking 3 seals. The first seal needs a vow to heaven, sealed with blood. After Shirji was pulled to the cliff edge, I pricked my finger and let blood drop onto the pendant. Then, I made Shirji vow to transfer it to me. Under duress, she agreed. After unlocking the first seal, I brutally pulled her up and left her unconscious. As I dragged Shirji home, I was just as ruthless, carelessly throwing her into the woodshed. My father and brother, like in my past life, coveted Shirji, but I wouldn't let them succeed this time. I planned to use the spiritual spring to heal Shirji's face and figure out how to obtain it to unlock the second seal. The third seal requires dripping blood into the space, which would complete the transfer of the pendant. Back home, the neighbors and my brother expressed dissatisfaction with the woman I brought back, but I mentioned she might pay for treatment, so they calmed down slightly. When my father suggested waiting for her recovery to ask for payment, even considering keeping her as a concubine, I laughed coldly, knowing my father and brother's lustful nature. Walking into the kitchen, I saw it was empty except for porridge. This familiar scene reminded me of my past life. I recalled discovering a treasure only to have it confiscated by my relatives. This time, I wouldn't let them succeed. I discreetly added some croton beans to the food, and when my father and brother ate, they'd soon find out the taste. I visited my mother, who was still asleep. She mentioned my relatives not giving her food, and I clenched my fists, vowing to make them pay. In my past life, I suffered. This time, I wouldn't tolerate it anymore. I silently served my mother a bowl of porridge and cared for her until she slept. Afterward, I gathered my backpack and found a valuable 100-year-old ginseng inside. As a medicine woman living by collecting herbs, I had found it in the mountains for my mother's illness. In my past life, I hid it under my bed but couldn't use it before Shirji stole it. This time, I hung it on a beam to dry and hide it from being discovered. After doing this, I returned to the mountain to retrieve several silver bars from the treasure site. Reflecting on my past life, I saved Shirji but received no thanks. My relatives desired her beauty and wanted to keep her as a bride, but I didn't stop her from leaving. Shirji, feeling resentful, looked down on me and demanded things. I told her it was none of my business, and she could leave, but she lingered at my home, recovering. I had no choice but to agree. In my past life, Shirji followed me and used her spatial scroll to steal all my treasures and the ginseng for my mother's illness. She assumed the treasure was ownerless, but it was an injustice to me. When I took my mother home, Shirji pulled out 10 ounces of silver from the treasure and arrogantly said, "This is for you, let's call it even." As she left, she intentionally left clues, leading the mob into our home, resulting in our brutal deaths. Shirji thought herself cunning, but I found it deeply unfair. My mother's condition worsened, and I took her to town for treatment, but Shirji secretly followed and stole everything. I returned home to find Shirji gone, leaving behind a deceptive gesture of repayment, which ultimately led to our family's demise. This time, I vowed not to repeat the past. After securing the silver, I quickly returned home and divided it between carrying some and burying the rest. When Shirji regained consciousness in the woodshed, she cried in fear. I entered, and seeing me, she relaxed slightly. "Tang girl, thank you for saving me, is there food?" I brought her a bowl of porridge, and she frowned.
You gave me this after I gave you such a valuable pendant?
I replied coldly. "We're poor, this is all we can afford. Don't eat if you don't like it." Shirji wolfed down the porridge, expecting me to fetch water for her to wash. I said, "There's a creek behind the house, go yourself." Shirji was infuriated, shouting,
I'm injured. How can you make a wounded person wash themselves?
I slapped her, stunning her.
You're picky. Do I owe you?
Her eyes welled up.
You hit me?
I overturned the bowl over her head.
For an ungrateful beast like you, eating is a waste.
Shirji shrieked, dragging her injured leg to the creek to wash. As she washed, she screamed again.
My face! What's happening to my face?
She turned to me with a twisted face, accusing.
You ruined my face. You're a cheap woman. I gave you that valuable pendant, and you treat me like this.
I stood by the creek, arms crossed, replying.
Who's the cheap one? That pendant was payment for saving you, we're even now. One hand gives money, the other gives goods.
Shirji stood miserably in the water, unable to help but cry. After a moment, she calmed down, washed up, and limped back ashore with a humbled expression. "Miss, could you gather some medicine for my wounds?" I sneered.
You insulted me and still expect me to gather herbs for you?
Shirji clenched her teeth.
How do you want me to do it?
I said, "Kneel down and beg me." Despite her anger, Shirji finally knelt before me. "Please, miss." The next day, I brought Shirji some medicinal herbs.
Boil them yourself.
Shirji took the herbs, tearfully pleading. "Miss, could you return my pendant? It was left by my mother. You're kind, please let me cherish it while I recover." Knowing she wanted to use the spiritual spring in the pendant to heal faster, I handed it back. "Take it." Shirji thanked me profusely, her eyes shining. When she was alone, I left on purpose to let her use the spiritual spring. Once she used it, I went out. "Shirji, clean up. Don't just eat without doing anything." Shirji lowered her head, covering her anger, and left to clean the house. After she left, I pricked my finger and added a drop of blood to a jar. A strange sensation arose, confirming the second seal had opened. When she returned, I noted, "Shirji, make more medicine, my mother needs some too." Shirji was reluctant but didn't argue. I took some medicine to feed my mother, only to find Shirji had consumed it all. I silently watched her, amused. Her face would heal quickly, but this would bring her trouble. My father and brother were irresponsible, leaving all household tasks to me. They gambled and drank when they had money and lorded over the house when they didn't. In my past life, I was timid and submissive, but now I just needed to add some ingredients to their food to make them regretful. Thanks to my efforts, my mother recovered after drinking the medicine infused with spiritual spring. Shurji also lived well, her facial scars healing, restoring her beauty. However, she no longer acted meek around me. I passed by the woodshed at night and heard Shurji muttering curses, "Cheap woman. You dared make me kneel, steal my pendant. I'll cut you into pieces." I laughed coldly, knowing she'd eventually realize who the real cheap person was. The next day, I took my mother to town for a checkup. Returning home, I saw my father and brother holding on to Shurji, their eyes filled with lust. "You've lived off us for so long," they demanded. "If you can't give us money, stay as our daughter-in-law. Our family was once wealthy too, it'll be good karma." Shurji was terrified but dared not refuse outright. When Shurji saw us, her eyes lit up, and she rushed to assist my mother, appearing very ingratiating. However, I knew she was just using us temporarily. Shurji acted submissive in front of us, but she was actually plotting to exploit us. My mother asked if she was willing, and Shurji frantically shook her head, "No." My father and brother grew angrier, demanding money. As they grew more irate, Shurji pulled out her pendant and offered it to them. "I have no money, but I have this jade. Will this do?" I couldn't believe her audacity. She had vowed to give the pendant to me but now used it to buy off my relatives. My father and brother were thrilled and took the pendant to town to pawn it. After they left, my mother advised Shurji to leave, but Shurji's leg hadn't healed yet, so she had to stay. I laughed sarcastically, reminding her, "That pendant, you already gave me. I suggest you leave soon." Shurji denied it. "Who said that? Is there proof I gave it to you? That's my jade." That night, my father and brother returned drunk, heading towards the woodshed with enthusiasm. Shurji's screams pierced the night air, and I remained indifferent, closing the window. The next day, I entered the woodshed with porridge, finding Shurji disheveled on the floor.
Eat!
She knocked over the bowl, shouting hoarsely.
Get out! I don't need your fake kindness. Tangin, you're the real cheap one. If not for you bringing me here, I wouldn't be like this.
I raised an eyebrow.
Miss Shurji, that's hilarious.
You were dying and begged me to save you, then serve you.
Now you blame me?
My father and brother took turns guarding the woodshed, exploiting her. Shurji, covered in bruises, finally pleaded with me. Tangin, I was wrong before, I apologize. I have a secret to tell you. I remained expressionless. What secret? Shurji gritted her teeth. The jade pendant, it has a great significance. At that moment, I realized she never intended to reveal the pendant's secret. The token inside was a rescue signal from the Night King, Mu Rongtian, but she refused to use it because she was greedy, wanting to save it for future use. Now, she remained unwilling to give up that opportunity even as she became my relative's plaything. I said in surprise.
The pendant? What's so special about it?
Shurji shook her head. You wouldn't understand. I'll tell you when I get it back. I insisted. That's unlikely, the pendant was pawned by my relatives. Shurji was shocked, her voice sharp.
Pawned?
I nodded. Yes, they took it to town to exchange for money the day you gave it to them. Everyone in the house knows, there's no secret to it. Shurji sat down despondently, her eyes empty, pounding her chest, and crying out. It's all over. I'm so unlucky. Others who time-traveled became rich heiresses, but I became a poor man's daughter, struggling for food. I asked.
What pendant? What space? What cheat? Miss Shurji, your words don't make sense to me.
Shurji was angry.
You local fool wouldn't understand. Get out!
I rolled my eyes, not surprised by her attitude. Shurji always felt superior, but now she was just a prisoner here. I said coldly. If you're rude again, I won't help you. Shirji came to her senses and pleaded.
What I said earlier was in frustration. Please don't mind it. Mississippi, help me, or I'll die.
I gestured for her to explain clearly if she wanted my help. Shirji took a deep breath and told me. The jade pendant has a space containing Night King Mu Rongtian's token. If it's used, his guards will come to rescue me. If you help me, I'll have the Night King give you endless gold and silver. I feigned surprise and asked. Is what you're saying true? Shirji nodded, having no choice but to beg. Miss, can you think of a way to retrieve the pendant and bring it to me? Please, I beg of you. I thought for a moment, clutched her hand, and said. All right, I'll try, but remember today's promise, don't repay kindness with malice again. Shirji shook her head feverishly. I won't. Save me, the pendant is yours. I'll also give you a lot of silver. I required her to swear. Swear to me that if you break your vow, you'll be cut into pieces and die without a grave. Shirji swore without hesitation, just as she had easily pledged when asking me to save her at the cliff. I smiled, turned, and walked out. Actually, the pendant had been with me all along. I rented a small house in town, preparing for our future life. 3 days passed, and Shirji was living miserably. I felt it was enough and returned to deliver her food. Miss Shirji, I bought back the pendant. I produced the pendant, and Shirji's eyes gleamed with fervor, shouting, Give it to me. I handed it to her, and she bit her finger, letting blood drop onto the pendant. But I had anticipated this. I reached in and used my injured hand to press where necessary. Blood entered the space, and the third seal opened. The space resonated with me. Shirji let out a wail as a brilliant symbol emerged from her body and flew into mine. She stared at me incredulously. How is this possible? You, how could you? Why did the space change ownership? How did you know the transfer method? She shook her head frantically, feeling desperate. I held the pendant, feeling the token and spiritual spring's incredible power inside. Shirji thought of something and asked, You knew about the 3 seals from the start? So, you made me swear at the cliff? I smiled, squatting beside her, and softly said. Taking something from you wasn't easy. Shirji was stunned, tears streaming down her face, cursing wildly. But I remained unmoved, having taken away her greatest reliance and witnessing her collapse. Hope turning into despair was what hurt her most. I patted her face and coldly turned to leave the woodshed. Outside, I headed to the mountain cave to move the treasure, preparing for a new life. Returning home, my mother's internal injuries had mostly healed. I took down the ginseng and stewed a chicken for her. This is chicken? She asked in surprise. I nodded, telling her not to let my father and brother know. My mother was uneasy, fearing they would kill us. I gripped her hand, a fierce light in my eyes. We would never again eat leftovers from them. They did nothing, yet frequently beat my mother and me. When they had money, they spent it lavishly. Mother, we'll have a better life from now on. I was determined to avenge my mother and ensure she lived well in her old age. She had always been my greatest support. Later, my father and brother rushed into the kitchen, asking if I had hidden Shirji's pendant. I feigned confusion. What pendant?
My father said.
Shirji's pendant. I countered. Isn't it pawned already? They exchanged glances, and I added. What treasures could it hold? She's already used them, right? My father and brother slapped their thighs. She cheated us. I said further. Is she saying the pendant is with me just to escape? They suddenly understood and rushed to the woodshed. I then heard the cries and curses from inside. I knocked on the door, and my father, enraged, stood in the doorway, looking to die. I said. If the pendant really has treasures, I'll go buy it back and show you. My father gave me some copper coins and the pawn ticket, instructing me to retrieve it. In truth, I had already planned this. After tearing up the ticket, I bought a low-quality jade pendant, disguised myself, and spread the news to create a false scenario. Finally, I returned home with the fake pendant, and my father and brother took it to Shirji. She was disheveled, her clothes torn, and seeing me filled her with hatred. My father and brother were satisfied with my attitude and demanded she address them as masters. Shirji refused, so my father violently smashed her head against a tree, forcing her to call them masters. When Shirji saw the pendant, her eyes lit up, but soon she realized it was counterfeit. My father and brother seized her, accusing her of deceiving them. Shirji stubbornly defended herself, but it was useless. The pendant was smashed, revealing nothing inside. They brutally beat her, leaving her covered in injuries. I watched coldly, then turned and left, closing the door. After venting their anger, my father and brother asked me to treat Shirji's wounds. Heal her, don't let her die. Fix her face, but other parts don't matter. My father was somewhat remorseful, realizing they hadn't succeeded and now worried Shirji might die. I entered the woodshed with a bowl of medicine. Inside, it smelled of blood, and Shirji lay cramped with injuries. Miss Shirji, I've come to treat you. I smiled, took out the authentic pendant, and released the spiritual spring into the medicine. Shirji murmured and struggled to crawl over, her legs seemingly broken, her posture awkward. I slowly poured the spiritual spring, grabbed her jaw, and forced her to drink. Shirji wept, swallowing weakly. I then poured more medicine with spiritual spring on her face, causing her to convulse in pain. The spiritual spring would speed up healing, but the process was agonizing. At least a month would pass before she could barely speak. After leaving the woodshed, I dealt with another matter. At night, my mother suddenly developed a high fever and couldn't sleep. I frantically woke my father and brother, asking them to find a doctor, but they cursed. You're bad luck. Always spending money, a burden to us. Just let her die. My father added. There are other women to warm our beds, she's useless now. I cried, pleading. Mother is ill. But they were unmoved. I suggested taking her to town to see a doctor, and my brother yawned, saying, You only spend money and trouble us. She'd be better off dead. Hearing this, my anger surged, but I intentionally made a louder scene to attract the neighbors. My father and brother, cornered, dragged my mother out and threw her into the yard. We were kicked out of our home, and my mother was filled with despair and sadness. I supported her to my uncle's place, but they refused to take us in. So, we left. On the way, my mother worried about being a burden. I comforted her. Don't worry, mother. I've wanted to leave for a long time, I don't know what you think. She said. That home was suffocating. Now that we're thrown out, what should we do? Actually, my mother's high fever wasn't bad, she had been chronically ill. After I fed her ginseng chicken soup, she reacted poorly, causing the fever. I brought her to the house I rented in town, which was already cleaned, and a maid was waiting. My mother was surprised and thanked me for the arrangement. The next day, my mother's fever broke, and her spirit improved slightly. In town, we received help from neighbors who brought us plenty of food. Finally, my mother and I lived a normal life. Later, my father and brother, unable to bear the gossip, asked us to return home, but my mother refused. A strange man approached and beat them, stopping them from getting near us. This man was one of the leaders of the mob that slaughtered us in the past. He was a ruthless official. I smiled and welcomed him into our home. He came to inquire about the Night King. I used this chance to casually mention Shirji.
I rescued not a man, but a woman named Shirji. She was with a man who was shot and mentioned Mu Rongtian. Mu Rongtian.
The man asked.
Mu Rongtian?
I nodded. He pressed for the Night King's whereabouts, and I played along.
I don't know, she was at my home for a short time. My father and brother kept her in a separate room and wouldn't let me near her. Later, they suddenly had a lot of silver and hid it in the backyard, spending lavishly.
After the man left, my mother told me many things, crying. His goal was to find the Night King, but I seized the opportunity to quietly avenge Shirji and the mob. This way, the Night King's guards or the mob might return, and I could strike again. The next morning, someone came to report. Tang family, please return, your home was burglarized last night, and everyone's dead. My mother was shocked, and we returned to the village as in my past life, finding the mob had attacked, torturing people. Shirji's corpse was gruesome, her body naked and sliced into pieces. Her eyes were wide open in death, much like mine in my past life. I could imagine her dying moments, wanting to accuse but unable to speak due to being silenced by me. My father and brother were similarly butchered but clung to life. In my past life, they lasted a day before dying, this time was no different. Shirji couldn't speak, so the mob questioned my father and brother, subjecting them to severe torture. The doctor declared no hope, and I tearfully said, "Even if it's futile, we must try." How could I let them die easily? It was too good for them. After Shirji's body was taken away, I sent my mother off, prepared some medicine, and used the pendant to release spiritual spring, gently treating my father and brother. The medicine and spiritual spring could sustain them but not fully heal. With no skin and covered in wounds, they couldn't move or speak. They would soon awaken to a hellish existence. And I, pretending to be a filial daughter, would serve them without hard feelings. Beloved father and brother, please let me serve you. After administering the medicine, I waited quietly. My father and brother opened their eyes, saw me, and began screaming. I leaned over them and explained everything. Father, brother, it was me. In our next life, remember to respect women. A month later, I found their cries becoming too loud and stopped their medicine to send them to their graves sooner. I became known as a great filial daughter, and my medical skills were praised for keeping someone alive for a month when doctors said it was impossible. My uncle's family, who lived nearby, grew weaker, often suffering from diarrhea and losing energy. Some said they were startled by the bandits, others claimed it was karma for their misdeeds. Actually, I had tampered with their water. But I didn't want to kill them, it was enough to make them chronically ill as a small punishment. After my father and brother died, I quietly handled the property and land, changed our household registration with my mother, and moved to the capital. As the head of a female household, everything went smoothly. With the treasure by our side, life was comfortable. I continued learning medicine and secretly used the spiritual spring to aid me, gaining fame. In the capital, I took out Night King Mu Rongtian's token from the space and met him. Mu Rongtian, the male lead of Growing Vegetables for Text, was powerful and handsome. I said. This was entrusted to me by Shirji. Mu Rongtian took the token, his face darkening. After a moment, he asked, "What's your relationship with Shirji?" I teared up. I saved her when she was pursued. We became close friends, like sisters. Unfortunately, I wasn't home that night, and Shirji was killed along with my father and brother. After hearing my story, Mu Rongtian sighed and said, "I owe them. This promise I'll keep with you. You suffered and lost family because of me, I'll protect you in the capital." I bowed respectfully with tears in my eyes. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Mu Rongtian assured. "I know who killed Shirji and your family. Don't worry, I will avenge them." I bowed again. Mu Rongtian knew who the killers were, and so did I. This was why I came to the capital. Those who killed me, aside from Shirji, were that group of bandits. Let them wait, this is just the beginning.